You know, when you think about it, from these tiny remote drone strips in Africa to absolutely massive city-sized bases in Germany, the United States military has a presence in pretty much every corner of the world. But why? What's the strategy? That's what we're breaking down in this explainer: the strategy, the cost, and the future of America's massive overseas presence.
All right, let's just start with a raw number. According to the Department of Defense's own data, it manages or uses at least 128 military sites overseas.
And get this, those sites are spread across 51 different countries. That creates a global military footprint that is honestly unlike anything else in history. But, numbers on a screen are one thing. The real question, the big question, is one of strategy. Why does the U.S. keep up this enormous and incredibly expensive forward presence? What's the thinking behind it all?
Okay, so let's get into it. To really understand the why, we've got to start with the where. So let's do a quick tour of where these bases are all concentrated. First up, the Indo-Pacific. You will hear Department of officials call this the priority theater all the time. And you can see why. It hosts more than 81,000 U.S. personnel, with the biggest groups stationed in Japan and South Korea. And the strategic focus here is crystal clear: competition with China.
All right, now let's hop over to Europe. Here, the U.S. has a really deep historical presence. We're talking over 67,000 troops. The main hubs are in places you'd expect: Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom. And the whole setup is deeply connected with the NATO alliance, all with the goal of deterring Russian aggression.
Then you've got the Middle East and Africa. Now, the footprint here might look a little smaller, a bit more low-key, but don't let that fool you. It is absolutely strategic. The focus is really twofold. On one hand, it's about countering violent extremist groups, and on the other, there's this newer mission of competing with Russian and Chinese influence on the continent.
So, you might be wondering, who's in charge of all this? I mean, how do you manage a network this huge? Well, the military has a system for that, and it's called Combatant Commands, or COCOMs for short. The easiest way to think of them is like the Pentagon's regional managers. EUCOM handles Europe, INDOPACOM covers the Indo-Pacific, and so on. Each one is in charge of all U.S. military operations in their slice of the world.
So we've covered the where. Now for the main event, the why. What is the official rationale from the Pentagon for having this global posture in the first place?
Well, according to defense planners, the entire strategy really boils down to three core pillars. First, rapid response. Having troops nearby just means you can act way faster in a crisis. Second is deterrence. The idea is that a visible American presence makes potential enemies think twice. And third, assurance. These bases are basically a physical promise to allies that the U.S. has their back.
And here's something that is super important to understand. This mission and this network has never been static. It's constantly evolving. It all started with occupying Germany and Japan after World War II, then it morphed into this forward defense against the Soviets during the Cold War. After the Soviet Union fell, the footprint shrank in Europe and grew like crazy in the Middle East. And today, we're seeing another huge shift, this time towards so-called great power competition.
Right. Maintaining a global footprint of this scale, well, it's not cheap, not by a long shot. So, let's follow the money.
Okay, now this chart is really fascinating because it tells you exactly where the priorities are shifting. Just by looking at the money, forget the policy papers for a second, just look at the cash. The big money for new construction, it's pouring into the Indo-Pacific. And now look at the Middle East, a huge drop. This is that pivot to Asia we just talked about, visualized in billions of dollars for concrete and steel.
Now, to manage these gigantic costs, the U.S. has a key strategy, and it's a term you've probably heard thrown around in the news for years: burden sharing. It's pretty much what it sounds like. The idea that the countries hosting U.S. bases should help pay for them, either with cash or by providing things like land and services for free.
And we're not talking about pocket change here. The contributions can be massive. A report from the Government Accountability Office found that just between 2016 and 2019, Japan kicked in over $12 billion, which covered about 60% of the cost. South Korea chipped in almost $6 billion, covering over 43% of the costs there.
Okay, so the money is one thing, but maybe an even bigger challenge is political. I mean, basing U.S. troops on foreign soil comes with all sorts of complexities and risks.
Because here's the bottom line. Every single one of these overseas bases is on someone else's turf. They're in sovereign countries. And that creates what military planners call political risk. Just because you have access to a base today, there is absolutely no guarantee you'll have it tomorrow.
It all comes down to the politics of the host nation.
And believe me, this is not some academic what-if scenario. It just happened. Look at what went down in Niger in 2024. A military coup brings a new government to power, and boom, they immediately tear up the basing agreement with the U.S., forcing American troops to pack up and abandon 2 bases that cost millions to build.
So when you add it all up, the costs, the political risks, the new kinds of threats, how is the Pentagon trying to adapt? How do you future-proof this whole thing?
Well, the big idea is to shift away from that classic Cold War model. These giant, permanent fortress bases. In an age of precision missiles, they're just big, fat targets. The new thinking is all about being smaller, more spread out, and way more agile. The mantra you hear from military leaders is places, not bases.
The Air Force has its own name for their version of this, Agile Combat Employment, or ACE. And the concept is actually pretty simple, but it's a real game changer. Instead of putting all your eggs in one basket, like a few huge air bases, you spread them out across a whole network of smaller airfields, even civilian airports, to launch, rearm, and refuel. It makes it much, much harder for an adversary to take you out with one big strike.
And all of this leads us to the big, final question that policymakers are wrestling with right now. This American global footprint, a relic of the Cold War in many ways, is being forced to change in real time. The debate is no longer really about if the U.S. should have bases, but what kind of bases, where they should be, and what their purpose is in a world of new tech and rising powers. How the U.S. answers those questions, well, that's going to define its power and influence for the next 100 years.